our communities. Connecting Our Communities is a project that has been inspired by an independent lens film called Free for All, the public library. That film, an email came across my desk and encouraged us to go to a workshop with the filmmakers and find out what their cause is and perhaps make some screenings in our local communities. And I was game right away. I only had to see the trailer of the movie. So we got a collaborative group together, Helena High, Capitol High, Lewis and Clark Library, and Helena College Library Learning Hub, and we decided to put together events around the screening of the film Free for All. We have a whole month of events that are really exciting. This one's kind of one of my passion events. Tonight's panel is going to discuss the democracy and the civic principles of democracy and public spaces. So let me tell you just a little bit about this. So we're going to bring together community members of all ages, interests, and backgrounds to engage in thoughtful discussion about the value we hold for our public library, our public services, and our public spaces. Through community conversation and celebration, our hope is to collectively build understanding and inspire appreciation of the role these enduring institutions play in shaping our history, enriching our daily lives, and securing our future. So our panel that we have together today is -1. Melissa Romano is still up at the Capitol building and unable to attend. So we have Commissioner Dean. Emily Dean is a longtime Helena resident, and she has lots of experience serving her community, even at an early age, inspired by her mother and her grandmother. She volunteered and did community building activities. Since then, she's a graduate of Carroll College and has became an educator right after graduation. And in that way, her commitment carried through to the students that she served and the families that she served. And now she serves on the City Commission. This is your second term on the City Commission. And so her personal and her professional pursuits all demonstrate a strong belief in providing all Montanans with equal access to education and opportunities that improve the well-being of the individual and of our community. Next, we have John Adams. John Adams is the founder, and my library partner told me to tell you, I was supposed to say this. So, founder Adams. So, John Adams is the founder and editor-in-chief of the nonprofit independent news agency, Montana Free Press. John's extensive and award-winning career in political and investigative journalism have earned him a reputation for thorough and credible reporting on issues that are vital to our community. His knowledge and experience networking, researching, and reporting reaches the highest standards of providing open and inclusive access to information essential to an informed public in a functioning democracy. And then, whoops. Okay, and finally, Brad Langsford is our has a professional career in forestry and decades of experience in providing for community lands management and maintenance. He has since 2008. He's been with us in the city of Helena as the Open Lands and Parks Manager, which makes him responsible for nearly 2,000 acres of parkland that belong to the residents of our community. He has received awards for his service, once receiving in 2014 receiving the Governor's Award for Excellence in his performance for Helena's Upper 10 Mile Creek Municipal Watershed, which we all know is the source of our drinking water. And access to the clean water in our community is essential to the well-being of our community members, obviously. So I will introduce Emmett. Emmett Rogers is the Teen Services Librarian here at Lewis and Clark Library. I forget which library I'm at. And she'll be moderating the discussion tonight.
All right, we are going to get started. So, panelists, I have assigned you some questions, but we also are going to give it short of time because there are 9 questions and we only have 90 minutes or a little under. So please keep your comments pretty short. if I give you a time, try to stay under that time, and then if I have to end up just moving us along, I apologize in advance. So this first question is going to be for all of you, just sort of set the tone of this whole interview and discussion. But please do feel free to interact with each other and answer some things, because that makes it more interesting. So, what is your familiarity with public institutions and public services, and how do you define the latter? And Emily, how about we start with you?
Sure. Well, thank you. I'm really excited to be here with all of you. I really loved this question. I would say there are 3 times in my life that I think have been kind of my most formative experiences. The first was the deregulation of the Montana Power Company that led to my mom and both of my uncles losing their jobs. The second was when I had the privilege to serve as a U.S. Senate page during the Great Recession. And then the third was becoming a teacher. And really because of all of those experiences, I realized that my most formative experiences were shaped 100% by public policy that impacted me very personally and our community at large. And from those experiences, I made a lifelong commitment to wanting to serve the communities that I lived in and really be able to improve the lives of the people around me. And so I've dedicated my career to education and now elected leadership. And I think it's probably something that I'll never give up, but those 3 things were really what set me on this course. In terms of defining the public good, I love this question. I think about service as something, public good really is an action or a service that is for everyone in the community, regardless of size or community members' backgrounds or experiences, and regardless of who uses services or who contributes to services. And I think that it is the one thing that makes our communities function, and we always need more public good, I think especially now more than ever.
And if you were to differentiate between public good and public services, how would you?
Well, that's good. I think we provide service for the public good. And I think public good only happens when it is there for everyone, and it is not a zero-sum game. You don't get to have less access to public good because you maybe needed it more than others, and in fact it's something that it's always available to everyone and we should all contribute to.
Fantastic answer. That's a better answer than I would have given a good question. John, same question?
Yeah, thanks for having me. This is fun and timely.
Yes.
Very timely. So, public service and public institutions. Institutions to me are sort of the, to some extent, the brick and mortar, the infrastructure. And public service is what happens within them, and for the people who benefit from that. And so we set up our institutions to provide a public service. I think when I think about public institutions, I think the first thing we think about tends to be government, right? It tends to be some function of government. But I think public institutions and public good and public service exist outside of strictly government. I mean, certainly we have a government of and for and by the people, or at least we're supposed to. I think those institutions are designed to provide a public good. They're there to connect society so that we can function together and get things done together as a group of people who exist in a place.
Sure.
Whether that's your local, your neighborhood, your city, your town, your state, or your country. But there are other institutions, like the one that I represent, which is a news organization, that are also, in my view, providing a public service, access to information that helps us understand how some of these institutions function a lot of times, but also maybe just information that tells us, what's going on in our neighborhood or our community. There are varying degrees of, I think, public service that it can occur at the government level or the nonprofit level, or even just public service is knocking on your neighbor's door and asking if they need a hand shoveling their sidewalk. I think we can think about public service in lots of different ways, but generally speaking, I think about public service as work or acts that we do for the benefit of more than just ourselves. That it's for the benefit of our community, of our society, and that the institutions are ways in which we can organize that.
Sure. Makes sense. The delivery systems.
That some of them are delivery systems, yeah, absolutely.
Okay, Brad, same question for you.
So when I left college, I started my career working for institutions that protected wildlife. I worked for the Colorado Division of Wildlife, and then that evolved into working for the United States Forest Service. So I had a good familiarity with working for the public to protect something, protecting wildlife, protecting our national forest. I left the public sector and went into private industry for a good number of years, involved in forestry, where my focus was producing lumber, and worked for a large company here in Montana that had a number of locations, and that lumber was for a public need to construct homes and buildings and so forth. But really, when I came here to Helena, and I was exposed to what it takes to run a municipality on a daily basis. So, of course, being in the Parks Department, my focus is protecting the natural resources within our natural parks and providing that service to the public. But I got to interact with the water department, waste, transportation, and got a real feeling for the second part of this question, which is providing a public service, what it takes to meet the essential needs of citizens of this community. And it's fascinating to work at the real high level in helping protect your watershed and planning activities up there to enhance and protect our water quality, but also to work with all of my co-workers to provide these services to the citizens. So yes, very interesting question.
So I was hearing from each of you a really different angle on that, which is awesome, and kind of feeds directly into the next question, but I wanted to highlight that I kind of got something that serves people equally, something that benefits and builds community good, and then finally something that is to protect. And that's the way that you give public services, is in protecting something that may otherwise disappear without that. Which leads us straight into ecosystems. So public services tend to act as an ecosystem. There's a variety of different players. They serve different functions. Some of them may act as protectors, some of them may act in ways like symbiotic relationships. Could you tell us, John, one way that your work contributes to the public good, and what gap you see in the ecosystem, at least here in Helena?
I think the work that we do, which is primarily to try to, Eric likes to talk about our work as explaining Montana to Montanans. And I like to expand on that a little bit to say, explaining Montana to Montanans and anybody else who cares about Montana, or the things that happen here. Our public service is providing information. Is right now, we're in the middle of a legislative session, so a significant amount of our energy is devoted to covering what's going on up at the Capitol about a mile away from here. And explaining it in a way that we can provide context and nuance so that readers, not just in Helena, but throughout the state, can understand a little bit better not only what's going on in that building, but how their actions as individuals who elected representatives to serve in that building, providing them tools and resources for being able to see what their elected representatives are doing. And so, in terms of the ecosystem, I think one of the key roles that we play is in providing that high level information and context about what's going on in our state from the policy angle. But the ecosystem should be much more layered and diverse than that. The ecosystem should involve a lot more organizations like Montana Free Press at a lot of different levels. When I first moved to Helena, there was, the Helena Independent Record, of course, was a thriving newspaper. We had the Queen City News. We had a thriving sort of, blogosphere where you could go and find all kinds of information with different viewpoints. I think, we fit. I think we, in the Venn diagram of the information ecosystem, there's some overlap between us and libraries. A place where you can go publicly accessible to get information about all kinds of things from lots of different viewpoints. And the ecosystem is not as diverse and as healthy today as it should be, or even as much as it was just a few years ago. The ecosystem, when it comes to access to public information, when it comes to journalists who are out on the ground becoming experts in their particular areas, covering things like school boards and what's going on with the local community neighborhood school, or what's going on with your county board, or what's going on with that new 26 pump gas station on the edge of town that people didn't know about until they started breaking ground. Part of our job in our ecosystem is overlapping with other public services and helping people understand what those things are, why they matter, what opportunities citizens have to participate in those things. And I don't want to put words in Commissioner Dean's mouth, but I would suspect that she would be happier if Helenans had more access to more information about what the City Commission is doing and had more opportunities to participate, because otherwise they're left to your own devices, right? There's only so much that the city can do. They have a little bit of a bully pulpit, and that every time they mail you your water bill, they also send some information about what's going on. But there isn't really a good mechanism for unbiased access to information about what's going on in our community, much less other areas of our government. So I think our ecosystem is not in really good shape right now as far as the journalism world is concerned. I think there are some bright spots. I think, quite frankly, Montana Free Press is one of them right now. But there continue to be a lot and significant threats, not just in the economic funding models that have kind of collapsed and left us in this place where we have a less rich ecosystem of news and information. But there are, for those of us that are still standing, there are really direct threats to our very existence from hostile entities that don't want us to exist, that don't want the public to have the kind of access to information that we provide. And so I think while the ecosystem, there's a potential for the ecosystem to improve, there needs to also be concerted efforts to protect and nurture and conserve that ecosystem so that organizations like Montana Free Press can thrive, because it's not a given that we're going to be successful in the long run, and it certainly isn't a given that anybody else is going to step in and fill in the gaps. And I think I kind of already addressed the gaps part in my answer.
Yeah, you
so
did.
Hopefully I don't need to.
No, that was great. Thank you. That was awesome. I actually was wondering, Emily, Brad, do you have a response to that?
I 100% agree. I think when I think about this ecosystem part, one of the things we're always lacking is true, meaningful public engagement. And the law has one standard of what that means, and we meet that standard, but holding public comment at the end of an agenda item for an empty room, or even a Zoom room, which we in the City of Helena provide both, is not necessarily the way that we get the kind of engagement that actually shapes really good public policy that serves as many people as possible. And I don't think any public body has figured out how to have that meaningful engagement in a manner that provides equal access to everybody and doesn't turn into an unhealthy,
Podcast.
right, and that's, I mean, it's something that I've been thinking a lot about, because we really are, there are so many cool things that are happening in our community, and I was so happy when Montana Free Press hired Javon to cover Helena local news, because you just don't hear about much of it, of the good things happening, and when, folks need to be held accountable too. And I worry about what happens when we don't have that meaningful public engagement, and we don't have the same type of public community spaces that existed even 5, 10, 20 years ago, not to mention 30 years ago when you had thriving civic organizations with hundreds and hundreds of members. And that is something that I think we really could use better public engagement, and it's just hard to figure out how to make that happen when you don't necessarily have a thriving fourth estate that is providing that kind of information to the public.
Yeah, the decentralizing of the public forum has been,
Yeah.
I think, tough for all sorts of information systems, but also in getting out the word about whatever it is that you need people to know. Brad, did you have a gap that you also wanted to highlight?
Well, obviously, I look at it from a completely different angle, and, the focus of my work is to provide the public an opportunity to interact with the natural environment. And we have that natural environment so close to us here in Helena, and it's such a precious resource. But also part of my work involves education from the standpoint of educating the public of what is going on out in the natural environment and what type of work do we need to do to benefit the natural environment. And just in the next month, I've got 4 speaking engagements similar to this one that are focused on public education of the environment. So that's what I see the ecosystem more that natural ecosystem, but that's what's great is everyone in society participates in a different manner.
One thing I would just add a little bit on that you both touched on, which is the fact that we have fewer public forums,
Opportunities for discourse.
but we have more information than we've ever had. And that's part of the problem, is there's so much information that it's hard to sort of, cut through the noise. I mean, it wasn't long ago that forums like this were places where people went to get information, right? I can envision this room 10, 15 years ago would be full. And one of the reasons maybe that it's not is in part because it's so hard to cut through all of that other information to give people an opportunity to know what's happening and things that they might want to participate in. And there's just overwhelm. And because our information ecosystem, our smartphones, these devices that are pumping gigabytes of data into our lives on a daily basis, I think that's also part of the problem, and something that, conversations like this, I think, can help sort of, look for solutions to how do we restore public engagement and create more opportunities for public forums.
Absolutely. I think we're great producers of information and sometimes great consumers of content, but there's definitely, at least from my view as a librarian, a little bit of a gap where it comes to interpretation. And the result is that people pick a strand, right? They pick a narrative or a few interests, and that's what you'll follow, which pigeonholes you really quickly. And you don't get to have these kind of public conversations. You don't get to engage with things that are outside of that interest or even maybe belief set.
Yeah, have your own ideas challenged.
Right. Yeah, challenge you. I'll have to challenge you during this talk. I think you all actually kind of jumped into a public service solution to a gap that you have thought of, but if you could sort of Google interview style dream up one public service that you would love to just like snap into being. Funding is no object, you can do whatever you need. What sort of public service would you like to provide? Would it be a public forum? Would it be a space where citizens can come down and talk about a different thing all the time? And if so, how would you accomplish that?
I can jump in. There are two things that I've thought a little bit about. The first is that research suggests that the way to bridge divides is to experience service with members of your community or not your community. That creates opportunities to understand one another on a deeper level. And my dream is if we could have, opportunities of like community-wide days of service or days of action where, everyone gets a paid day off, no one misses any homework, and we could all work on service projects in service of our community. So it could be cleaning up a park, or it could be reading to a classroom full of children, or it could be painting your neighbor's fence, or serving lunch to the elderly. And I just truly believe that if you have the opportunity to engage and serve with someone who you have very few similarities to, you're normally always going to walk away with a much better understanding of their background and likely more empathy of where they're coming from. I think on a strictly public policy level, if I could do anything in the world, it would be to ensure that really no child has unstable housing or experiences homelessness, because I truly believe that if we are able to support young kids at the very beginning and through growing up, we would have a much better world where people could make good decisions for their lives.
And those two things aren't unconnected, right?
Right,
You can support key development stages and then transition that into, kind of putting our money and our effort behind teaching engagement and teaching service. Want to take that one down?
I love Emily's idea. I'll just tell a little anecdote. Some may be more surprised than others to learn that I had brushes with juvenile delinquency when I was a youngster, which forced me into community service. That was a great experience for me because I found myself at a food bank, putting together boxes of commodity food goods, government issued, food pantry food, and that was an experience that really kind of opened my eyes because it's not something that I would have chosen to do at 15 or whatever it was, but it really kind of it gave me a window and a perspective into something that I was unaware of. I was serving along people who I did not normally interact with in my life. And I do think that community service is incredibly, I think one of the things that we lack in our sort of information overload world, and I am very, as our elected officials I'm sure are as well, I'm very attuned to the polarization and the sort of binary nature in which we've sort of decided we're gonna carve up the world. With me, against me, left, right, Cubs, Yankees, whatever it is. We've kind of cordoned ourselves off, whether we've done it intentionally as individuals or whether it's been systematically kind of foisted upon us. It's the world that we live in right now. And I think one way that we can bridge some of those divides is by spending more time with people with a different worldview, with a different life experience. And that's something that we try to do at the Free Press all the time, is to, in the course of our reporting, get ourselves outside of our comfort zones and try to see the world through the people and the subjects that we are covering, and present that in a way that we can hopefully get other people to see a different perspective. Because whether it's community service, whether it's participating in community conversations, or whether it's even just exposing yourself to ideas that are not your preconceived, pre-baked idea of the world, that is how we work better together. Because like it or not, we are in a society, and we are only growing. And as we grow, these tensions are going to become, in my view, a lot more challenging. And we can't just keep picking sides and approaching everything that we do in the world through that sort of binary mindset. And so I think community service is like forced community service. I would love that. I would vote for that. I endorse that.
I'd probably get voted out for that.
You know, I have the good fortune to work with volunteers here in Helena that spend thousands of hours out on the natural parks, working in the forest, working on the trails, working to combat weeds, and we provide firewood to warm people's homes in the winter. In a perfect world, we could accomplish everything we need to do here in Helena with volunteers, and you know, that would be my dream. But we come closer than a lot of communities, I can tell you that.
I was thinking, actually, I feel like those two ideas could connect up. I mean, if you had a mandatory service, or we had a day where we did celebrate the act of serving public good.
Well,
You
even
interested in a whole town's worth of volunteers?
I think it was last spring, a ton of volunteers came and helped landscape, Zeroscape, the Lawn Justice Center. And it was, I mean, almost all volunteer that helped.
By the way, I walk by that a lot, and it's fun, because there's all those little signs that tell you the different grasses, the different plants, and yeah, it's informational.
I see what you did there. Yeah. All right. So now I get to talk about libraries for a second, so please bear with me. One of the ideas behind libraries is that people, if given free access to information, will be able to make more informed and responsible decisions as democratic citizens, and that this makes our community better. This may sound a bit like a guinea, but at the moment, quite a few thoughts that possibly the founding fathers had in mind or took for granted are coming under question. And so it is possibly a good time to think critically about some of these things that we just take for granted. So, do you think that's true? And why? And I was thinking of history when I wrote this question. Historically, can you think of a counterexample? Because I'm interested to hear if you all remember your history classes.
I mean, this question kind of makes my case for me in a sense. I mean, yeah, I mean, at Montana Free Press, our model is to give away our news and information. We're not a for-profit, we're a nonprofit. And our mission is rooted in the basis of this question, which is we absolutely believe that a better informed society makes better decisions, and what better way to inform them than by making it freely, easily accessible. And again, I think that's where, you know, in some respects, you know, our mission and a library's mission are very much overlapping. It's to challenge ideas, it's to provide information, it's to help contextualize the world, it's occasionally to hold people accountable, it's to, in our case, you know, journalists are the first drafters of history, right? We're the ones who are recording the moment right now. Presumably, if, you know, this information still exists, 50 years from now, you know, people will be reading about what happened in this legislature at Montana Free Press and our archives that hopefully still exist. But that is, so I do think it's true. I think it's absolutely true that when people are better informed, they collectively make better decisions as a group. If you are acting with less information, you have less ability to come to conclusions, you know, or you don't even participate. I think that's also a risk, is that people either don't participate or they participate only nominally because they're being called to do so by some other force. But it's less of their own volition, in my view. So I think information is empowering. I think it's critical to our freedom. I think that's why it's the First Amendment to the Constitution, or to the Bill of Rights, is that you know, we have a right to speak freely, to access information, and to know what our government is doing. And so yeah, I absolutely believe it. Can I think of a counterexample? I don't know if I understand quite what you mean by that in terms of, you know, where given access to information is problematic?
Sure, so I'm thinking either, can you elaborate on why that would have been seen as a risk, as it was actually by several of the founding fathers of like, wait, we're gonna give all the people the power? Are you guys sure?
Well, and we're the experiment, right? Did I cut you off before?
It can either be, elaborate a little on that, or can you think of the time in history when people were given too much power, or to go back to your earlier point, and perhaps this might be more attractive to you, in the fire hose of information that we live in now, that has in fact caused a lot of people to stop interacting.
I don't think the fire hose of information in and of itself is a bad thing. I think what we lack is a corresponding civic literacy. You know, like forums like this, you know, there isn't enough education being done. We do take things for granted. And we take public education for granted. We take, I think we do take our access to information for granted. And part of the problem now is that information, we have all this information, but so much of it is filtered before it gets to us. It's not like when you go to the internet or you go to social media, it's not like going into a library where you can browse the stacks and pick and choose what you might want to read or what you're in the mood for that day. Now you have algorithms that deliver that information to you, not based on what you personally are interested in, but what a computer program thinks you will be interested in and how that will benefit the bottom line of the company who owns the platform. That's a whole other ball of wax that we probably don't need to get too deep into now, but what we have is information being delivered to us by platforms that in the current day that we are in right now are allied with political regimes. And so now we are losing access to the independence of information. So it's not just the volume of information, it's those of us that are trying to provide those of us that are trying to provide information that is not algorithmically derived or delivered are now facing attacks. And if given an opportunity, I will talk about this great New York Times book that just came out this month, or last month, Murder the Truth, that really outlines how, I'm not being hyperbolic when I say that access to public information is under attack. Absolutely under attack right now. And so I don't think there is a risk in having too much information. I think there is a risk in allowing somebody else to control the information that you have access to.
Yeah, 100%. Well, and you were describing Montana Free Press earlier as a context bringer, right?
Mm-hmm.
So maybe that information does come often sans context now. Brad, I saw you nod. Did you want to respond to part of that?
Well, I think we all understand that knowledge is power, and power can be used for societal good or for societal evil. And I think we've seen that all throughout history. And obviously there's been times we had a local example in Lincoln, Montana, where someone used the library to acquire information to do societal evil. But you can't start censoring information for that reason. You just have to hope that by providing that information and everyone having access to it, that everyone will be able to ferret through the good and bad. And I think we're all seeing that this sudden flood of information that we've gotten in probably the last 15 years anyway, more so, is almost overwhelming people, and now they do have to start filtering. And but I think that it still has been proven that an informed public is going to make a lot better decisions than those that are naive.
One thing I think about a lot, and I think this comes from my classroom experience, is we are in a time where there are literacy in general is at an all-time low in our country, and I always think about the bombardment that my students and you know, friends and peers and family receive online, and you have no context of information that comes to you online, but you also then have no opportunity to actually engage deeply like you do with a text. And I get really worried because I think about, you know, what we see happening with the legislature and the things that institutions like Montana Free Press cover and all the really good information that would help people be better and smarter and make good decisions. And I worry about how many people are actually not getting that information because they have not had to sit and read a long-form investigative article because you know, AI and any other host of platforms will shorten it right up for you and give you the summary, and then you can write your paper for your class. And so it's if you're even writing a paper. And that is something that I really worry about, is our ability to think critically as a society and evaluate multiple sources of information when we are an algorithm is producing content for you that is sometimes very hard to fact check because it comes at you so quickly. And you know, I don't think that, you know, we'll probably figure out how to deal with that anytime soon, but it is something that I think a lot about, and why public education is so important, and why it is important that we have freedom of information so that, you know, not just kids but adults have access to a variety of opinions, and can have the skills to actually read, comprehend, and make informed decisions on.
Absolutely. Also, throw back to my middle school debate. When we were forced to argue against our own beliefs, which is part of, I will say, part of the reasoning behind this question, right? That there are things that you think are rock solid until you're forced to argue the other side, and you find that you actually do have avenues to make those arguments. And you have legitimate ones, but you have to parse through a lot of information. You do have to think critically about your own beliefs, and that itself takes a kind of information literacy skill that maybe we aren't engaging with on a wide level. At least we're not teaching in a really organized way. Which sort of jumps us into our next question, which is, what do you think is the relationship between rights and responsibilities in a perfect world? Where, you know, we have the moment that we have, and I do want to discuss that moment, but if you were to say, you know, we've done everything right, we've filled those gaps in the ecosystem, and everybody's needs are met, where does right meet responsibility? And actually, I think on this time, we will start with you, Brad, if that's okay.
Well, I think that, you know, we have a right to enjoy public amenities that our society has, and they're available to the general public to improve your quality of life. But I think we all have the responsibility to look deeper into that, you know, not take the 30-minute shower, conserve water resources, conserve electricity, heat, and we've got those public amenities that improve our quality of life, but also we have a responsibility to respect the environment and try to be responsible citizens. And that's kind of the angle I look at it from.
That makes a lot of sense to me, actually. Emily, do you want to respond to that one?
Sure. I think, you know, what comes to mind is kind of the Montana ethos of take care of your neighbor and mind your own business. And I think that in terms of, it speaks to that balance of rights and responsibilities, where I think that we have an obligation to serve one another and protect the things that are make our communities special, while also respecting each other's privacy and personal decisions. And you know, I think that sometimes that's hard, but all the more reason why having those deeper interactions with the people around you, regardless of their background, produces an environment where you're able, and Montana, I think, is still unique in that way that you can have very, very different opinions and very, very different experiences and still, you know, go hiking with that person or, you know, go fishing with that person or that they're, you know, your best bud. And it goes back to the binary piece. I hope that we don't get too far away from that in Montana where it does not have to be always one or the other. I think there sometimes are very clear moral and moral positions that we should take a stand for to make our community better and protect the vulnerable. But I really do believe that if we just took a little bit more time to help out our neighbor and not be in their business, we would be all better.
As someone who only moved here for a year and a little bit ago, one of my favorite things about Montana, especially about Helena, is that people genuinely seem to care about each other. And that's something that I had missed. I've been out of the Intermountain West for, I don't know, 15 years or something at that point, and I was so glad to come back to that feeling. So I agree. I think it doesn't have to be a binary, but it certainly gets set up that way sometimes. John, did you want to add?
My guess is you weren't in the Midwest.
What? Yes, I was.
Were you?
I was briefly, and then I was on the West Coast.
Because I do think that that's one of the things that, like, why Montana, I'm from Wisconsin originally, and I think one of the reasons why I felt so at home in Montana was, you know, there's so much similarity in that sort of, you know, take care of your neighbor and mind your own business. And, you know, it's an interesting question, the sort of like rights versus responsibilities. And I think, you know, rights are sort of defined, right? They're codified in many cases. And responsibilities are kind of subjective. And I think they're sort of oriented in values. And like what one person thinks is your responsibility might not be what somebody else thinks is their responsibility. You know, I think one thing that like most Montanans think is their responsibility is that they're out on a country road somewhere and somebody's pulled over with their hood up. Most Montanans are going to stop, right? Especially when you're in places where you don't have cell service or whatever else. But that's just sort of to me that's kind of a value, right? And so I think a lot of responsibilities are really kind of interwoven with values. And so, you know, is it my responsibility to shovel my neighbor's walk when it snows and they're gone for the week? No. But I might do it because I view it as
In line with the value system.
in line with the values, right? Like you know, I guess there isn't really a right there. It's my right to ignore their sidewalk, I guess. It's my right to call, you know, the city and complain that they haven't shoveled it. But, you know, maybe, you know, it's my responsibility as a neighbor to shovel it for them. But that, you know, I don't think you can enumerate responsibilities the way you can rights. And so I think, you know, that's where we get into those gray areas where we need to be having conversations and we need to be having conversations about our values. And values aren't always, you know, all the hot button stuff. I think we tend to kind of lump values right now in our current environment, you know, it's around religion or politics or whatever, you know, the biggest policy issues of the day are, and then that's where we kind of get into those binary discussions. But there's a lot of gray and a lot of nuance within those things, which again, I think kind of brings us back to sharing experiences with people who are different than us. And the ways in which we do that are in places like libraries or in forums or at a branding or, you know, at volunteering to work on trails where there are people from all walks of life and different political ideologies who all care about the trails for different reasons and probably find common cause in their shared love of the trails, for example.
Do you all think that with every, you know, codified right comes certain responsibilities? Do you think that every gift comes with ethical responsibility to use that gift for the public good?
I mean, I think the moral answer to that is yes. I don't think,
What's the actual?
I think in practice that's not always the case.
Okay.
I think so. I think it boils down to the basics of being a good and responsible person. And if you're doing that, everything in here is going to fit together as far as doing those things like helping your neighbor out or looking at the bigger picture, trying to improve your world. I think that's what it's all about.
I think the cultural expectation of those responsibilities, I think, plays a part, and I think that's something that we, as a society, maybe have started to lose. There's a researcher and author named Robert Putnam who wrote Bowling Alone and then also Our Kids. And essentially, Our Kids is an incredible book if you haven't read it, but it's almost like this entire idea where there was a cultural expectation that every child is the community's child. And so regardless of who they are, where they're from, you help to make sure children are cared for. And instead, in the 80s, our society started losing some of these civic institutions, and instead now we're essentially pulling up the ladder after we're done climbing it, instead of waiting for the next person to come up. And we care about my kid, but not the community's kids. And I think that's one of those things that if there's not that community expectation, that we are responsible for one another and we are responsible for the well-being of each other, is where you start to run into trouble.
Well, I think what we're kind of talking about too is the norms,
Yes.
right? I think the responsibilities that are associated with the rights are the norms, and now we're losing our hold on some of the norms, and norms are being kind of turned on their head, and in many cases just ignored entirely. And I think that's where one of our biggest dangers right now in this country is sort of the abandonment of norms that were sort of the connective tissue between the rights and the responsibilities.
Which you can never really create. You can never create enough laws to cover all of what we
No.
might even collectively, maybe in the 80s, have agreed was something that we think is important. But it was a soft power thing, it was a norm. It wasn't necessarily a law. Although I do think it's interesting that kind of coinciding with that trend that you all were noting, before there was a COVID-19 pandemic, the Surgeon General had declared a pandemic of loneliness in the country. And I'm going to mangle the stats, so I won't try, but it was something along the lines of how many people any given adult in the US could call if they were having a terrible day. And that number had significantly dropped. And I wonder if you think that that is a natural effect of this trend. But correlation doesn't equal causation, so you could say no.
Well, I mean, as a society, I think it's pretty clear that, especially in Montana, I mean, I can look at our suicide statistics, and that's a whole another ball of wax. But I mean, I always look every year at the Youth Risk Behavior Survey, and it essentially tracks trends in young people. So whether it's essentially risky behavior, feeling lonely or hopeless, and not just, I mean, during COVID spiked, but they have not been going in a good direction for a long time. And I know, because of a book and a Netflix series that the entire kind of conversation around young people and social media is kind of reaching a new point, which I think is really important. But how we address that as a society, to your point, we can make laws, but the cultural piece is something that you can't legislate. And so how do you create a system in which you can start to make lots of people feel supported?
Absolutely. That's a really good answer. Would either of you two like to add in anything?
Well, I see it on a daily basis when I arrive at work. We've got 2 benches. People are waiting to go in to the city-county building to access services, and I see older generation interacting with each other and visiting about the weather or what's going on in Helena. And unfortunately, I see the younger generation just staring at their cell phone. And I think that's where you get the potential, if you disconnect too much from your community, that's where you can get into a situation where people are in a community, but they're not connected, they're lonely, and it's an unfortunate result of all this flood of information. That you may be visiting with someone else in the world, but you don't even know who lives across the street from you.
Yeah. Okay. Just want to add anything, or shall we leave it there?
One of the upshots of the pandemic, in my view, was, walking, we were lucky enough in Montana that we could still go out and walk our dogs, right? We could still do things in this state because we're relatively spread out relative to folks living in bigger cities and whatnot. And it was funny because I met more of my neighbors during the first, 6 months of the pandemic than I had living in my neighborhood for, a couple of years. Because I never saw them. But during the pandemic, people would just go outside just to sit on their porch and just to and so you would have these conversations with people that, from the sidewalk, to their porch and get to know people. And, I think information is definitely, the things we talked about, the social media, the phones, the distraction, the constant barrage, is problematic. I do think that there are still, within their tools and opportunities. I mean, one of the cool things that we have now that we didn't have a few years ago is the ability to get on large-scale video conferences. Anybody can do that now. You don't need all kinds of technology or go somewhere. And so you can bring people together from all kinds of places in conversation, and you can do that at the community level. So, the phones and the information in and of itself is not the problem. It's how we're using it or not using it, in my view. And this isn't going away. We're not going back to newspapers. We're not going back to, landlines. We're not going back to, there is no going back. I think the idea that, that there's some idealized version of our past that, we can maybe someday get back to, not happening. We have to realistically look at the future that we are facing and find a way, how do we recreate these norms? How do we recreate these connections? How do we recreate the access to diverse views and information so that it isn't just filtered through algorithms or chosen by governments, how we interact and what information we consume. Because we're really close to that right now. And I don't think people realize just how close we are. And I think if there's one thing that we take for granted more than anything in this country is that we do have that freedom. That we have that freedom of speech, we have that freedom of expression, we have that freedom of assembly, we have that freedom. Our First Amendment is the thing that when you talk to people from other countries who don't have something like that, that is the thing they admire most about us. And that is the thing that I think we are at greatest risk of losing right now because we've taken it for granted. And it's something that what's happening with libraries, and banning of books, and what's happening with the attempts to silence speech all over the place. These are really dangerous things that I think lead us even deeper down, these paths to loneliness and disconnection and isolation and polarization.
Yes, I agree with that.
I'm a big fan of libraries.
Yeah, this has been great for us. Thank you. Appreciate it. One of the things I'll go ahead and add on. I've just joined the panel. One of the things that always strikes me is, and not unlike Montana Free Press, is that there are not that many free places to either have a conversation with somebody that you don't know, or learn about anything that you might want to learn about, or see a lot of perspectives on it, right? And one of the things that I think is that libraries do offer as true value is you don't have to have any money. You don't have to have a car to walk through these doors, right? If you want to just come in and sit down and stare at our beautiful mobile art, that's fantastic. Do it. And then you can talk to a whole variety of people, all walks of life, and I think that is hard to hard to explain, but also hard to overvalue. Switching tracks a little bit. Has a public service, public institution, or public space transformed your personal perspective of what the public good is? And then what about that changed your perspective? If you can think back to a time when you, and you already mentioned the working at the food bank, you can think back to a time when you interacted with something and that was a real pivot point for you. I think we actually have enough time to do this, so Emily, I'm just going to start right with you and then we'll go to Brad.
Sure. You know, one of the things I love about serving on a commission is that people will always let you know what they're thinking. And when I first got on the commission, you know, and I felt like I'd been fairly engaged, like active part of my community, and I was involved in a lot of organizations, and so, you know, I felt like, yeah, I hear lots of different perspectives. I talk to lots of different people. And once I got on the commission, you hear about it from people when they are upset. You rarely hear, I mean, I think Brad is in the department where people, love our open lands, and so they will be really lovely about our open lands, but if you do something they don't like, you will hear about it. And I have gotten such a better appreciation for kind of the depth of diversity of perspective in a place like Helena. And I think we are a community that has a lot of people that are really experts in their fields in a lot of different places. So folks who interact with the state and all of the agencies, they know their content very well. We have a lot of educational institutions. We have a thriving small business community. And folks have very, very strong feelings about the things that matter to them. And they will let you know it, especially if there's something that they think is going wrong. And so I have a much greater appreciation for being able, really understanding I think where folks are coming from. And what I have found is that most of the time, most of our correspondence comes in email. And if they leave a phone number, I always prefer to give them a call instead, because they might be raging in an email, but as soon as you get on the phone with them, or you know, if you happen to know their nephew or their cousin, and you can get a personal connection, all of that seems to fall away, and you can get to the root of whatever their issue was and then find a solution. And so I think that, I feel like my perspective has, I wouldn't say changed, but grown in how to better interact with people in a manner that's going to get them the results that they need. And even if it's not 100% what they want, normally if you acknowledge that you've heard them and that you are working to find some sort of response or solution, they'll be grateful, and you'll have someone that'll give you good feedback from then on. But that is one aspect of serving in elected office that I was not necessarily anticipating, and I think it might be one of my more favorite things. Sometimes uncomfortable, but one of my more favorite things about serving in office.
Wow, so slightly more recent for you.
Yeah, there's
You
always
watched
one.
Parks and Rec,
There's
the TV
always-
show, presumably.
Yes.
You didn't think that there was going to be yelling. Brad, did you?
Well,
let's
I
get
mean,
into Parks and Rec.
obviously, in my position, before I came here, I always knew that open spaces were important to the public, and especially in Montana, we have an interesting relationship with our open spaces. But then it came to a whole new level when I got here, and I have actually enjoyed seeing how much all of this means to everyone. And it's had its bumps in the road. I was gonna move a trailhead a little ways and didn't realize it would ignite a firestorm. But in the end, you work with your community, and they're not always going to be happy with you, but they the community needs to understand that sometimes there are experts that know things that need to be done, and so, you know, that's really changed my level of thinking and raised the bar on my personal level of performance every day working is trying to, you know, provide for the public the best I can. And so it's been a really great phase in my career. So
That reminds me of something I had heard Nelson Mandela was talking about, where he was going to make a very unpopular decision. And he eventually just said, look, they elected me to lead. And I think that might be part of being a great leader or an expert in the field, is you know when to step forward and say, look, I'm going to lead on this one. It will be for the public good. And when to step back and say, okay, please tell me about it. What do we need to do differently? What needs to happen? And have a little bit more of a conversation around that. Okay, having decided, as I think we mostly have, that it is a good idea to just have a more informed public. This next question, we are actually just going to go to everybody on, because we do have the time to cover it. So many democratic ideals speak about the right to think, speak, and learn without censorship, to speak out and petition for change when necessary, and to be heard and treated equally. What should and can public institutions do to further these ideals? I think John will start with you.
This one's very top of mind for me lately. You know, this is a really tricky one because this is one of those issues that I think is very easy to be kind of framed in our sort of current binary political world that we're in. But, you know, the opponents of free speech are not from one side or the other. There are plenty of opponents to free speech across the political spectrum. I think what we are seeing right now in our current political state is a reaction to a era in which a lot of folks felt that their free speech was being impeded by, you know, wokeism. And I think that there has been, you know, which would be sort of like a liberal, you know, restriction on freedom of speech, freedom of ideas, and so, you know, that you know, you had to talk about certain things in a certain way or you would be canceled. That was, maybe we're still there. It's hard to keep track of all of these things these days. But that was certainly, any way you slice it, an attempt to silence certain speech. We are in an era now where we're seeing very active attempts to silence certain speech, banning books, removing certain policies from state, you know, from government agencies, you know, clearing entire websites and histories of certain language. You know, as a journalist, I consider myself, you know, I feel like Elon Musk inappropriately co-opted this phrase, but I really do think of myself as a free speech absolutist, that the Constitution doesn't say what kind of speech you get to or not get. I mean, we can't say scream fire in a burning, you can't say fire in a
You can't infringe on others' rights.
Yeah, but just because you don't like somebody's speech doesn't mean you have a right to silence them. And so, yes, I think freedom of speech is absolutely a small d democratic ideal. I think it is, again, I think one of our primary and most important rights in this country, and I think it's the one that we absolutely take the most for granted right now. Another plug for David Heinrich's book, Word of the Truth. He should give me a commission. But it isn't, you know, and what he outlines here is an effort by a conservative movement to shut down organizations like Montana Free Press, to use the courts to threaten, intimidate, and otherwise prevent us from doing our job of holding the powerful accountable. That is not this is not a small thing, this is a very big thing. But this is not the only place in which we see that happening. And whether it's, not allowing certain speakers to speak on college campuses, like in Missoula, for instance, or, there are lots of different ways in which people infringe on our right to speak, on our right to express ourselves. I believe that, organizations like ours, we exercise that right, and we make decisions about how we exercise that right. I do think that comes to the responsibility question we talked about earlier. We're not going to knowingly publish things that are false. We are not knowingly going to publish things that are designed to incite or otherwise inflame or create divisiveness. That is our choice. But if we wanted to write things that were inflammatory and divisive, that is our right. We just don't choose to exercise it in that way. That's the responsibility piece.
And there's a little bit of professional responsibility playing into that with the Florida State now.
Well, and it's a matter of trust. I mean, our goal is to build trust with as many people as possible. Our goal is, we're not looking to build trust with one group or another group. We're trying to build trust with as many people in this state who want access to information and provide it to them. And the way we do that is by doing it as straightforward as we can, providing them information and analysis that isn't filtered through a lens designed to achieve an objective other than inform.
Absolutely. Brad, would you like to?
Well, I think as a public servant, I feel in my department, the Parks Department, we have the responsibility to provide that platform for the event. And it, regardless of what message is going to be at that event, it's providing the platform for a safe event and an event that will be successful. So setting up the public for success. And I think that's what, as a public servant, that's our responsibility, is to work with all the stakeholders. And that's what we're trying to do here in Helena, and I think we do a really good job of it in Helena, and in providing that platform for people to speak their mind.
And going back to the first question, it kind of gets back to your idea of you are protecting a resource that exists and that acts as a platform, where maybe John, yours gets back to attempting to provide context for something that's being generated constantly. Emily, would you like to add?
I'm going to come at this question from maybe a perspective of elected bodies and elected leadership. I'm going to use a micro and kind of macro example. One of the things that I have noticed since getting involved in local government is there will be a lot of items on agendas, and if you ever watch a city commission meeting, oftentimes there's very little discussion. And I think that I've really worked hard to try to ask questions on almost every single agenda item. One, out of curiosity and wanting to make a good decision, but two, because I think it's really important to get that kind of information on the public record, regardless if someone is listening right then or not, because I know, as a history major, I know someone's going to go back and listen to that or read the transcript, potentially 20 years from now, whether it's on a sidewalk variance or a trailhead. And so I think in terms of when you think about, our democratic ideals, it is really incumbent on elected officials to make sure that we are continuing to provide perspectives on the record and inviting public engagement. And I think, and this goes to more the macro level, where I think all levels of government can do a better job, and I think there's a lot of ways to do that, but engaging the public in ways that feel accessible to them, where there is a back and forth, because a public comment with local government, state government, federal government, at the local level you can provide public comment at the end of an agenda item or at the end of a meeting. At the legislature you can provide comment as a proponent or opponent. And at the federal level, really your only opportunity is writing letters, phone calls. And we're seeing, fewer and fewer opportunities to interact in person in, for example, town halls or forums or other opportunities to ask questions and have a dialogue. And at a local level, I would really, and something that I'm trying to work on over the next couple of years is really finding ways to actually have that engagement back and forth with the public, because sometimes it feels very, I think, disheartening when members of the public come to give comment and maybe have a question or want feedback, and that's not the way that, we use Masons, but that's not the way that parliamentary procedure necessarily operates. And we do need to use parliamentary procedure so that we can have an orderly and efficient meeting. But that doesn't have to mean that we have no other opportunity for conversation, feedback, disagreement. And, I hope that more levels of government provide more opportunities and forums for that type of engagement, because I think that is when you start to lose some of these things, like opportunity to speak freely and have an honest conversation with your elected official. That becomes eroded when you don't have those opportunities.
So coming around to the other side, we're essentially having that forum here, where we can hopefully talk through some of these ideas and some of these issues. How do you bring people to it? As a public institution.
I've found that my most effective is social media. I hate it, but it is, that is where the engagement happens. And, I think if you can create a carrot of getting folks to a place, so whether it's, at a brewery or in the park or, on the walking mall, if you can have an incentive for folks to actually engage, I feel like that makes a big difference. But in terms of getting the word out, social media is the name of the game, because we don't necessarily have, I do love the Monday newsletter that I get every week from Javon. But it's not, Montana Free Press isn't necessarily set up as like a daily, it is an investigative journalism institution, it feels, and so
we're not providing comprehensive coverage of Helena.
Yeah. And
it's okay.
Neither is the IR, the news works hard to do. KTVH is it maybe a quarter of our meetings. So it's one of those things where the routes to finding people are limited. And for those that aren't on social media, that's where I worry, where are those people finding information?
Yeah, totally. I like that you said incentivize, and then you said essentially go touch grass. Like give them either something from the brewery, or give them actual grass, sunshine, and community to get connected with, and let that be the incentive. I think that's a great idea. Yeah, I just was wondering if you wanted to respond.
I was just wondering if you were about to give, WTH a plug.
Oh, wouldn't he love that? I think that he probably finds even more comical that the parody account has turned into a source of local news.
I know.
That is not untrue.
Yeah.
At least it does, in fact, start those conversations. Whether or not one can use it as a news source is, I think, maybe a topic for our next time we have a panel. Okay, so we're going to switch again a little bit. I think we'll probably make this our last question, because you've all done a wonderful job of defining what public good might be through these questions. But what are the boundary of public services in your mind? When should they start and stop? And in this case, we're not talking about public service as an act, but we're talking about services that might be provided to the public. So why don't we start with you, John?
Oh, man.
I make you do it first because you think very well of me, apparently.
This is a tough one. Again, I think this is kind of philosophical, right? And, to me, I think public services should be adequate to provide the basic necessities of life and to reflect the values and the desires of the community, right? I mean, public services, strictly speaking, are paid for with taxpayer dollars. And so I think they should stop at whatever the community decides. You know, I mean, some communities provide internet as a public service.
I was gonna say, there was a time when, you know,
Yeah.
telephone wires weren't necessarily considered required for all households, but now it is required that you be at least able to connect to the grid.
And, you know, different communities are gonna set different standards for where those services should stop and end. I think at the base level, we should, you know, I don't want our roads to be privatized. I don't want our police forces to be privatized. I don't want our fire departments to be privatized. I don't want, you know, there's some services that I think are really important to be provided by the public, for the public, and to have government oversight to make sure that those are being, you know, provided appropriately, effectively, efficiently, and for the benefit of the public good. I think there are other services that, you know, some communities may decide are going to be a public service. And those communities decide for themselves that they're going to levy more taxes to pay for those things that they decide as a community are in their interest. And really, I think that really is a decision that's made at the community level or the state level. And one in which, you know, I think everybody probably has a different opinion on where they should start, where they should end.
So, talking about deciding it at the public deciding it or the community level, does that mean a vote? And if so, does that reflect the will of the public, or do you think there are other forces that act on that so that it can't really reflect the will of the public?
Well, and, you know, if we're talking about strictly public in the you know, the sense of, you know, services provided by government agencies, then, you know, ultimately it is kind of a vote. You know, I consider Montana Free Press a public service, but we're free to all. You don't have to vote to get us. You don't have to be 18. You don't have to be anything. You just have to have the ability to pick up your local newspaper that runs our stuff, or go to our website or sign up for our newsletter. So, you know, again, but that's a service we've chosen to provide and that people have decided they want to step up and help pay for.
Right.
So, you know, it really depends on how you want to define public service, I think. And then I think, but if we're talking about the kinds of things that these two public servants do in their day-to-day, then, you know, ultimately the voters, I think, get a pretty strong say in that.
You know, I agree. From the standpoint of the Parks Department, we do everything we can to make sure that the users of the parks are going to be able to have an enjoyable experience. But where I see the line kind of becomes blurred is the behavioral aspects of what they're doing when they're enjoying the experience. So as you can imagine, I get a lot of, well, this dog did this, and this mountain bike did this, and, you know, it does reach a point where we're trying to provide all those things, and I'm getting pressured as a public servant to work on etiquette. And that's where, you know, I think the public does have a responsibility at a certain point to not only be prepared with the proper foot gear and sunscreen and all those good things, but also to be a good person out there and interact well. And whether it's, you know, softball and soccer and all the activities we have at our developed parks. So it is an interesting line, and it's a line that we see almost every single day in the Parks Department, is trying to make it all work. But the public does have a responsibility that they sometimes may not be quite at the level they need to be.
You guys aren't policing Little League games?
We could privatize that if you prefer.
I mean, our police chief does coach Baker. So.
It's a little bit. Emily, do you want to finish us out here?
Sure, you know, this question brings me back to that ecosystem question, in that we have these things that are paid for by tax dollars that are the very basic foundation of public service in government: water, wastewater, fire, police, open lands, public health. And then we have a whole another piece of the public service ecosystem that is the nonprofits and entities that support all of the other things. And in a community of our size, those are the organizations that truly make the difference on some of the life improvement issues. So, for example, we do not have any kind of funding streams at the local level to, or local municipal government, to address, say, behavioral health and substance abuse. All of that falls under the entity responsible for helping with that is public health, which falls under county government. However, we do have an opportunity as a municipal government to work with our nonprofit entities that provide the services and supports to vulnerable people. So we work very closely with the hospital and with the Friendship Center and with God's Love and those entities that, you know, really, I mean, oftentimes interact with our emergency services, but also with parks and our streets department. So this question brings me back to that ecosystem, that it is not necessarily hard boundaries, but I think it's the ecosystem is determined by the needs of the community and the lengths at which the community is willing to help, not just fund, but support some of those areas. And on the whole, I mean, I think Helena is a very generous community. It's sometimes less so financially, but in time and willingness to provide volunteer hours and support. And it's something that, you know, we really could not live without a lot of these nonprofit organizations that supplement all of the basic services that local government actually provides.
Yeah, and they do kind of come to around to addressing those harder to legislate issues as well. Things like loneliness, things like information literacy. Although, again, plug for your local library. We also try to do stuff about that.
So do we at high schools.
And at the schools, yes.
Yeah, we have something to do with that.
Yeah, a little something. Well, thank you all so much for being part of our panel. I'm going to repeat your names one more time. City Commissioner Emily Dean, Montana Free Press Editor John Adams, and Open Lands Manager Brad Langsgather. Thank you so much for being with us. I'm Evan Rogers, I'm the Teen Services Librarian. We definitely owe this evening to Joanne Didrikson, so you have to come back up here. So thank you.